Welcome to Athletes to Entrepreneurs, the Alumni Journey. I'm Rob Finkelstein, CEO and founder of Alumni Direct. And we've set out to create a platform where we can help all types of athletes and college alumni and business alumni and fraternity, sorority, giving a platform, the premier platform out there to just do everything about connecting and networking and using that affinity relationship. And we're trying to put content out there to work and help people in different areas. And we're really excited about the show. The whole idea is to inspire and teach athletes that there is life after sports. And there's some big issues out there with athletes transition. And I'm excited today because we have an expert in this field. We have Dr. Daniel Zimet. And what we do here is we're going to kind of go through different things and talk about it. He's a sports psychologist. He's a National Handball Champion. He's going to tell you all about that too. It'll be interesting to find out more about that. He's got 34 national championships, and he's the lead investigator in the athletes transition study. So Daniel, thank you on this Mother's Day. We're both going to get in trouble, so we're going to keep it short. Thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here, Rob, and I appreciate what you do at Alumni Direct, and thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So we'll start out kind of fun questions of tell me a little about growing up. I mean, you're yourself were an athlete across different sports. Talk about you growing up playing sports and how that shaped you going into college and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, sport, it was an enormous part of my upbringing. More casual sport, which I think was a little bit more common when we were young and, before television and so on. And I just did a multiple of things. Most of my sport activity was with soccer, and that was more organized. I played travel up until my teen years and then varsity. But I also played baseball, tennis. I would almost always be found on my skateboard in a typical 1980s fashion, skiing. And I'm a third generation handball player. My grandfather grew up in Brooklyn playing after the Great Depression. My father plays, my uncle played, my brother still plays. So sport has been an enormous part of both my community and also my family.
That's great. Now, we all say, did you have one particular sport that you had a dream that you wanted to be a professional athlete in?
No, I wasn't that kid. I think most athletes who make it to the collegiate ranks really invest themselves in a single sport, although there are many who are extraordinary enough to potentially play collegiate in several sports. I always diversified. On a given day. I could be skiing, I could be riding my skateboard, hitting a tennis ball against a wall. I just really enjoy all sport. They each have their own challenge and are fun for different reasons.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I always joke around, especially some of these times I'm talking to these guys or women that might have been professional. I say, I wanted to be a professional athlete. I just didn't have the skill set, unfortunately. But
yeah, I feel like there's a lot of people who are perhaps skilled enough, but they just don't have that singular focus to put in the hours necessary to get there in a single sport. And I was that person. My head was too all over the place to stick to any one sport.
Yeah, no, I agree. So let me, kind of putting you on the sports psychologist hat here a little bit. One of the things that we see is I guess the question I ask a lot of people is, do you see colleges helping to prepare athletes for their future after sports?
Not typically, although there are absolutely schools that are making efforts to do that and have programming, but generally, I would say no. I think that the life cycle of the sport environment, as far as its management is concerned, is very heavily focused on athlete development. So bringing people into sport, developing their skill set, maintaining their presence, building them to the point of excellence. And then there's the business of sport. But then there's the life cycle that brings it back from that point around to the other side, where you help athletes transition out of sport, maybe figure out ways of contributing to athletes or to sport itself as a civilian and not someone who's engaged in the actual performance of sport, and kind of giving back and building sport for the better in terms of sportsmanship, youth development, helping promote positive play. But I would say that generally no, and it's not just colleges. I would say that most leagues pay no attention to the athlete once they are off the roster.
Right. And it's like, it's sad. And I guess, like you said, there's organizations, and the more I kind of take a deep dive into this, I am seeing that there's the companies out there that specialize in this thing, and they want to do that and help as many people. And I guess, because to your point, I've heard it, we all mutual friend Taj talks about it, that at the school, like you just said, they're there to kind of develop the athlete and not necessarily, transition them afterwards.
Yeah, I guess I have two thoughts about that. One is, I think that many of the franchises are in a way dissuading athletes from thinking about life after sport. They see that as a distraction from their engagement. And I'll also say that although the institutions themselves may not be doing much, although some are, you have practitioners like myself, athletes who are retired, and other siloed organizations, a little bit like yourself, who are really making a very strong effort because they understand the needs of athletes once they leave, but they're fairly pocketed. There's no really unified message, protocol, program. There's no central office, so to speak, where an athlete knows to go once they leave sport.
Yeah, and it's tough. I was talking to actually a sports agent, and a lot of what we're trying to do at Alumni Direct is to create that platform where people can connect with each other, and a lot of people don't know how to do it. I mean, it's we talk about from a collegiate standpoint. If you went to an Ivy League school, fraternity, sorority, or an athlete, you might know how to network and connect. But what was interesting is he was talking about saying that most athletes, they don't. The best time for them to actually network and connect is when they're playing, and when they're at the height of their sport. Because a lot of what he sees is that transition from that professional athlete, like when they're done with sports, like, hey, help me out. I got this name. Like, sorry, your name doesn't mean anything anymore, which is kind of sad. And I guess that's why, hopefully, with folks like yourself, and we're going to talk about the athlete transition study, to help these athletes realize that they can do other things and maybe prepare them. In your experience, what do you see? How much do you feel that the success of athletes, and we're talking about like entrepreneurs or just successful business, how much of that is driven by them being an athlete and playing sports from growing up all the way through?
Well, I think that sport teaches an athlete a remarkable range of skills that are really going to leave them, I think, better suited to success than their non-athletic counterparts. I mean, there's no shortage of hard work, determination and drive, grit, being able to work in a community, coping with adverse events, dealing with difficult bosses, overcoming mistakes. So, athletes really are remarkable, not just physically, but mentally.
Right.
And although there are some who, when they leave sport, they have chronic conditions that will make it difficult for them. And pretty much every athlete leaves sports behind in terms of their life development because sport occupies so much time and attention. But a vast majority of them not just catch up, but I would say excel. Our greatest concern in the athlete transition study is getting them from the point of retirement, the moment when they realize they're not going to compete any longer, up to that point of adjustment where they really are embracing their life afterwards. That's a very difficult period. And I mean, subtracting out the athletes who have chronic issues, and that's a very important group to consider as well, really wanting to think about the ways that athletes can think about, leverage, prepare, be knowledgeable about, develop themselves, create a scenario where they know what comes after and within that transition before it's thrust upon them. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things. A lot of athletes don't know when that day is coming, so they're unprepared for it.
Right. And that's tough. Do you see, I talked a little bit about, and we talked a little bit beforehand, and just in general, like what we're talking about, this whole alumni thing. Do you see kind of a brotherhood or a sisterhood in your dealings with athletes, and they've got that same affinity. I mean, you just talked about, I mean, they have a commonality of they've worked really hard their whole lives, and whatever they do, they've made a lot of sacrifices. Do you see any kind of movement from we'll call it an alumni, just the fact that they played sports together? Do you see that?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a brotherhood of competition that transcends being on opposite sides of the pitch when you retire. And that fraternity is not one that you enter simply. It's not just a matter of filling out an online form and sending in a check. The few number of people that are able to play at both the collegiate and professional ranks, it creates an absolute sorority brotherhood that transcends time and place. And many of the programs that are trying to help athletes recognize that fact by creating, something of a team atmosphere / locker room / whatever, where athletes can find other athletes who are further along than they are in the retirement process, and create that kind of support system where the athlete who is struggling can speak to people who've been there and further, and can act as a mentor, as a guide, can help network them, give them things to think about. And honestly, those are the people that are more inclined to get listened to. One thing I really often lament about my 14-year-old is that I can say something until I'm blue in the face, and another 14-year-old will say it once and it'll stick like this amazing light bulb goes off, this flashbulb insight moment. And I'll be like, I've been telling you that for 2 years, but somehow it takes another snot-nosed 14-year-old to say it. So, we tend to listen to people who we really relate to. And for athletes, that's other athletes.
Yeah, for sure. It's fun. I'm listening to that and I'm laughing because I went through that in the teen years with our son. But what the amazing part about it is when they get on the other side of it, and they realize all the life lessons, it just becomes a totally different story, which is great. So when you get to that point, it's a wonderful thing. So,
we'll do a podcast about that when the time arrives.
Absolutely. Good luck with that. Peace be with you on that one, but it'll be okay. One thing that I want to talk a little bit about, and I think because it's kind of shaping athletes on the front end now. This whole NIL thing, it's very interesting. It's funny. I was watching a TV show last night and they were talking all about NIL and just how these athletes now can promote themselves in school. Give me your thoughts on that in general, and then maybe we can drill into a little more specifics on that.
On athletes being able to promote themselves?
Yeah, the name, image, likeness, where athletes can now promote themselves, where the NCAA is kind of letting people do that. From what I understand, it's the wild, wild west, but maybe tell me a little bit about that, your thoughts.
Well, one of the main issues you run into with collegiate athletes is most of them do not get scholarships. Most of them are not planning on going professional, and they represent the school in ways that brings often more revenue than any other factor, including tuition. That's not true for smaller schools, but certainly true for the larger ones. And for the athletes who have national brand recognition, but most don't end up rich from their careers, even in professional sport, the ones whose names you would recognize. And so my opinion is it's long since overdue for athletes to be able to gain something from their efforts. And so I'm really glad to know that there are changes that are taking place. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be chaos for a while. It'll probably take a few well-positioned, clever, and brand-named individuals to set something of a standard and be the flag bearer for what the future is going to be. But I'm personally very glad that it's happening, because you work with athletes who thought that they were going to have something that would allow them to kind of live off of their career in sport.
Right.
And things happen. very unpredictable things. And unfortunately, many of the sports that we love the most are rife with profound injury.
Right.
And it doesn't take much to drop a person from being in that elite 0.001% to now only being in the top 1% because of ligament tear, of an ACL, of, there's so many different things that can happen. So knowing that they'll at least have something that they can use as a way of bridging the gap between their sport and whatever career in life they're going to transition into afterwards, having that safety net to be able to utilize that. To me, I'm glad it's happening.
Yeah, no, that's a great point of view. It's building that foundation. I think some of the flip side and some of the people that I've talked on the show, former athletes, they think it's great and they wish it would have been, there when they were there, but their concern will be more of how do these athletes, who maybe they don't necessarily know how to manage their money and things like that. So that's some of the pitfalls, but I think.
Well, you're speaking to a problem that exists anyway, Rob.
Right.
There's a lot of people out there who are trying to actually develop financial literacy programs that can help athletes to better understand money. And let's be honest, how well did we understand money when we were that age? I just didn't have enough that I could do any damage.
That's true.
And so I believe that you're speaking to a problem that needs to be addressed anyway.
Right.
And my hope is that it will be included in any type of package when you're trying to help someone become a whole person. They need to have emotional intelligence, fiscal responsibility, social awareness. And for athletes, I think that's particularly important because they're often put in compromised positions
Right.
that just about anyone at that age would not necessarily have the cognitive fortitude to be able to manage because they're immature. They're just like everybody else their age, but they're being put in a position where they have to manage things that most people their age don't have to, including just exposure to a range of people who want to take advantage of them in any one of a number of different ways.
Right. Okay. How about, and you kind of joked before about the whole, the TV and things like that. As far as social media goes, obviously when you and I were growing up, it wasn't a big player. Now it is more so. We're not that we're dating ourselves, but anyway, as a sports psychologist and seeing, obviously there's positives, but seeing some of the damage that it's caused, do you deal with that at all? Does that come into play when you're working with clients and working with some of these athletes?
Yeah, not necessarily. During the transition, it's hard because it's not uncommon for fans to, speak their mind straightly without much information.
Right.
And so I think one of the downfalls with social media that's ubiquitous to the entire population is there's now a 24/7 news cycle that you can't escape. So it's not like you can leave the stadium, go home, and unless something is on the news,
Right.
Which is on television, in case anybody forgot, then you can kind of get a break from it all and not have to be exposed to it. But with Twitter, Instagram, not as much necessarily Facebook, you end up just getting exposed to some pretty horrific content. And unfortunately, the way the human mind works, anyone who's received a performance evaluation knows you can get 9 pieces of good news and 1 piece of bad news. And what are you going to go home remembering? It's the bad news. So it can be a very anxiety provoking and depressing experience to watch yourself get shredded apart. But the great athletes who have mental strength are able to separate their athletic persona, the part of themselves that is in the public eye and is in performance on the field.
Right.
They're able to separate that from who they really are.
Yeah.
The much larger aspects of themselves, because that person is almost a role that gets played. It's a uniform that they put on, and people on the outside only see that, and it's a shell. And they're able to recognize that they kind of you unzip it, you pull it off, you leave it in the locker room, you go home, and then you're a whole other depthful person who can hopefully separate yourself from that, because it does tear people apart.
Yeah, no, it's tough, and you're right. Unless I guess the guidance and seeing, the mentorship that might come from former athletes or coaches or whatever, just, would certainly help. It's just that, it was fun. I was talking to one guy, he was talking about a story about when his college baseball team and how they went out and then partied the night before, and they got to the game just in time. And nowadays, if that happened, because that was a while back, like it'd be news. I mean, you just have to be so careful of what you do. I mean, I always try to teach. I've always taught my kids, be careful what you put in writing, because it could be, passed out to anyone. So,
well, now everybody has a video camera, and there's just simply there is no such thing as a he said, she said a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And again, we're asking a level of maturity from people their brains have not fully developed yet. It's such a difficult circumstance to put them in.
Right. What, we'll kind of now start forwarding a little bit into just the whole transition of athletes, and it's for various reasons. And I had heard, and I don't know if you had talked about combat veterans. Was that you had talked about that? Just kind of
I'm sure that a number of people have, because the similarity between what veterans and retired athletes go through, and there's a mutual respect between the two of them. I think they both appreciate what each has gone through.
Right. And it's just that whole thing when you're, I guess as an athlete, you've had this camaraderie and you've been playing on the team all these years, and now all of a sudden you're thrust into the world and you don't have your friends and buddies that you live with. And I mean, how many, it's probably a small percentage of athletes that transition well, right? I would imagine most athletes kind of suffer at least something from,
yeah, I mean, I guess two things. One of the relationships between veterans and athletes is how many other professions can think of where you retire in your 20s?
Yeah.
And so there's that. The other aspects are what you described. The camaraderie of going into battle / competition together, where you're completely dependent on the other for your success or survival in war, success in sport. So it's important to understand that someone who's gone into combat, that's different than baseball, but there are similarities.
Yeah.
The transition process, part of why we're conducting the study that we are is to understand broad, large-scale numbers, different sports, different genders, different communities, different cultures. What do those numbers look like in terms of how people leave their sport? How many suffer, to what extent, and in what ways? Those are questions that still really have not been answered with any satisfaction. The estimates that we have so far is most athletes transition either immediately or within 6 to 12 months. And that's a tough period. About 20% of them, their transition is considered very difficult, sort of on the clinical end. But that's really not necessarily a good description. Although there's a difference between someone who is clinically depressed and someone who's going through a very difficult period, but maybe you wouldn't diagnose them with depression. They're both suffering. Right. All right, one is suffering at a 9 and one is suffering at a 7, but they're still suffering.
Right.
And so we refer to that as subclinical issues. They're not quite at that clinical range. My belief is that there are many athletes who are ready, relieved, and prepared. Most of those, in my opinion, are the collegiate athletes who've made the decision that college is all they want to do. They did what they wanted. They competed. Maybe they did all 4 years. Maybe they didn't. They're leaving on their terms, and their career looks like what they wanted it to look like. They don't have bad injuries, and they're just kind of done. And they felt like the experience was good enough. A lot of athletes are in that circumstance. But it really only takes one or two things to not be quite like that for it to really go sideways. Their career wasn't what they wanted. They didn't have control over why they left. The team atmosphere they were in was hostile or negative. They experienced terrible things in their program, sexual abuse or other kinds of misogyny. They were cut from the team and didn't have the ability to do what they wanted or were unfairly treated. There's so many different things that can go wrong. And when they do, it's fairly common for people to ruminate on that. So some of it is the preparedness. Do you know what comes after the day you retire? Because it's coming. It's a question of when, but it's coming. So are you prepared for that? And the other is, to what extent were you really feeling like you were in control? You did what you wanted to do. The moment arrived when you wanted it to. And that's not something that a lot of people can really say that it was in their control.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's what kinds of things, I guess, are out there, and as you do this study, and in a minute I'll let you get more into the whole thing about studying and what, but I guess what kinds of things are out there as far as help? I mean, so we've identified an issue with athletes, and most of them in a similar situation, some more extreme than others. But what kinds of help are out there? And as you, I guess the second part of that question, as you analyze the data from the study, what then can be recommended to these athletes to help promote them to be, again, getting to that beyond the sport and into their future lives?
Yeah. So let me start with your first question, then I'll have you repeat the second one for me. So
if I remember it, it was kind of rolling at the time, but sure.
Yeah. So your first question is, what are programs doing? Is that what you asked? Or
what kind of help is out there for them?
Yeah. So there's a lot of help that's more siloed. You have to look for it. Some sports, particularly the larger ones, have player association, right. The NBA, the NFL, the NHL, and so on. But when you look at the fact that there's upwards of 70 sports that are played collegiately and or professionally, vast majority of them have absolutely nothing at all. Those athletes in some ways might be better suited to the transition process, because the professional leagues are not, there's no media presence, there's no money. These are athletes who are kind of paying not just for their training, but often for their travel, even Olympians,
right.
Up to the point where they're on the Olympic team, are footing their own bills. And so for them, I think they have much lower expectations, but there's absolutely nothing available for them in terms of the franchises and the governing bodies themselves. But you sports like football that have the trust, gridiron greats, the NFLPA, and then you have smaller programs. Athletes for Care would be one of them. And those are out there if you look. But a lot of those either players don't know about or don't think to access or may not want to access. And you have to remember that athletes are tough as nails, and many of them believe that emotional suffering is something that is best kept secret, because to reveal it is to show weakness that might end up costing you either a position on the team or your standard position within the franchise of respect. It feels like something that you should be able to rub dirt on and get over. And so many athletes are not open to, aware of, ready, or flat out dissuaded from opening up about the fact that seeking help is actually a form of strength.
Right.
And it's hard to make that mental shift. But the way that I articulate it is, if you're injured, you go to a doctor. To recover, you go to your trainer. To get physically stronger, you go to the gym and get a physical trainer. To get skills building, you go to coaches. So why would you then decide that when the mental factors come into play, which almost everyone will argue are some of the most important variables in sports success, were you just going to learn that through osmosis or just sort of do it on your own? It just doesn't make any logical sense. And yet that is typically what happens. Sports psychology gets the least attention on a range of different domains. Even though that's improving, it's still a severe problem. So most of these programs are recently funded. They're not really entrenched or even given full access to the alumni bodies. And a lot of the athletes, I mean, I don't know that they necessarily reach out to them. And I'm not in those programs to know what happens and why. You have to have somebody from, let's say, the NFLPA to talk to you about that specifically. But the athletes who I have worked with on the NFL, so we're talking about a very low number, we're talking, single digits. Few of them end up accessing those programs. And I'm not entirely sure why. I had one person tell me he was just worried his information would get out. And he was like many professional athletes, they're super worried about their reputation and privacy, confidentiality issues. That said, there's so many retired athletes who care so deeply about future retiring athletes that if you look, you just go onto Google, or you could go into our website. We have a resources page. You can find people in programs. They are out there, but you have to be your own advocate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like an area that definitely we need to shed more light on. I mean, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do is with Alumni Direct, is to give that platform where we do highlight the resources. And I think you hit it, a lot of athletes, it's the privacy thing and all that, and just creating more of a private community where these athletes or other alumni for that matter can go out and have that interaction with each other and do that. So two other things. One, we'll get lighthearted because I think we talked about your handball career, so we're going to talk briefly about that, and then we'll finish up on how people can find you, and then a little more talk about the athletes transition study, which I think is fantastic, and athletes out there definitely need to take it for sure. And then anxious to see the results and how it can help athletes all together. So handball, tell us about handball and your national championships.
Yeah, well, so I play the Irish version, which is a court sport. So this is not the version of handball you'll see in the Olympics where you throw a ball into a net. This is striking a ball with either hand against a wall, and it's played with the same rules as racquetball or squash, although there's no tin. And, in my opinion, it's the greatest game out there. It's played in singles and doubles. It's frighteningly challenging. It's an incredibly difficult, but for that reason, rewarding game. I grew up watching my father and grandfather and uncle play. I got into it as a teen. I played very casually. It followed the same path as my engagement with other sports. I was always naturally gifted, but I'm small. And so most sports that you would see on television are out of my range. And I'm also just not someone when I was younger who devoted myself that fully to a single sport. So it wasn't until I was in my late 20s, early 30s that I really cared to play it hard. And I think that senior sports are very, very important, and our country does not prioritize them the way that we should. Other countries, Australia being probably the one that's at the apex of this, care very, very deeply about senior athlete engagement. Exercising for the sake of exercising ranks on the order of boring to the point of torture. But when you are exercising for a purpose, competitive edge, trying to stave off the effects of aging, that gives it a lot of meaning. And I find that it really increases my effort, probably 3-4 times fold than just exercising for the sake of doing it. And I love it. Sport as a senior is similar to sport when you're younger. It's community, it's achievement, health, It's a fair playing field. It doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, who your parents are, how much money you have, whether you're in jail or not. Once you are on the court, all is even. Everyone plays by the exact same rules, and whoever scores the most points wins, and the game doesn't care.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play for as long as my body will allow me. And that might be tomorrow, or it might be in 40 years. And I'm going to hope for the latter.
It's great because as you're talking about this, the thoughts are coming out. I have a cousin that played baseball just more like, little league, and might play a little high school ball. But when he got older, he got into the whole senior sport. And I mean, he's in his 70s and he's still excelling at baseball. And really the only thing holding him back is, just injuries. Because, that's the flip side, is that as we get older, unfortunately, our bodies break down a little bit more. But I mean, he does enjoy, and, they've got tournaments for it around the country and stuff. And it's playing against people that did play at a high level. But once you get older, kind of maybe your point, the playing field might level out a little bit, and just kind of back to.
Yeah, I think you brought up the best point, is who has stayed the healthiest. And you also brought up something that is just so wonderfully fascinating about senior sport, is you may find yourself playing against people who you watched on television, which is just amazing. And then you realize athletes are no different from everybody else. They're people. Yeah. They just happen to have been remarkable at something that brought national attention. So yeah, senior sports is a neat opportunity to be on the court with maybe a former Olympian, maybe a former World Series winner. You never know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to finish with, tell us about, get into the athletes transition study, when it started, and, what it's all about, and then kind of finally just where people can find you.
Yeah, so the athlete transition study, which you can find on the web, Instagram, or Facebook under that name, Athlete Transition Study, is a series of surveys. They take about 25 minutes to complete, and it's studying the retirement and transition experience of elite athletes and their long-term health outcomes. So we're just really wanting to understand as much as we can about athletes, how they undergo their transition out of sport, and what their long-term prognosis looked like, who they went to for support, or their programs that helped them. And our main goal is to give a voice to the athletes, which we intend to broadcast in a confidential manner to the extent possible. And our goals for the data are to educate fans and systems about what athletes go through. It's incredible to know that just on the most basic level of how many athletes, what kind of athletes struggle with transition, and to what extent and in what ways, it's hard to believe we don't really know that information. How is that possible when we know how many balls and strikes an athlete went through on any given, just the level of data that's available while they're performing,
right,
it is so microscopic. And yet we know nothing once they leave sport for all practical purposes. So we're looking at 70 plus different sports, men and women, adaptive sports, interculturally. We need the athletes to take the survey. Like I said, it's confidential, and we just want to give a voice to you. This is a way to easily give back, both to sport and also so that future athletes can have a better experience in their retirement. Because we're going to provide data to programs, we're going to write research articles, give talks, hopefully be able to identify athletes who are more likely to struggle with the transition, know what they need, provide some support in the right places so it can be targeted, and make a better experience on the tail end of that developmental curve, right? So when you leave sport, being able to adapt to life no longer as the athlete, giving back, getting on with your life, finding ways to thrive once you move on to that next chapter.
It's interesting. I would imagine, once the data is complete, what is there a target date, completion date? Or is it just
it's probably going to be an ongoing survey. We have, I would say at this point, close to 500 people, but honestly, that's not nearly enough to make the kinds of observations we need, because like I said, we have 70 sports. We
Right.
want to be able to talk about so many different smaller subsets of that data so we can know how people who competed in water polo in college or who did synchronized swimming, we want to understand their experiences as well. So probably we have some preliminary data that we're looking at, but until we are confident about the veracity of that data, we do not want to make preliminary observations that might end up proving erroneous. So I'm hoping to get 1,000 athletes, preferably by the end of the summer. And my hope is that every athlete in the country, at a minimum, will have heard of this study at least once in the next 18 months. So they have the opportunity. I want athletes to have the opportunity to share their voice.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it'd be great to see something like this on a ESPN or some of the larger platforms, which would get you the needed things. So I would imagine that, once this data comes out, it's shedding a light on probably a new career for some people. I mean, if you think about, whether it's sports psychology or just different organizations that can help these athletes. I mean, I know in talking to some people, they talk about the two big things in sports right now, well, at least the athlete, like one is the NIL, the other one is this career transition. And Taj talked about, and I've heard some of these other people that work in this field. It's just kind of the wild, wild west. And so hopefully surveys like this and the data out there can help to, create a field, something that, people start majoring in college to, because it is such a major issue, helping these athletes out in the future. And I'm sure, there's other areas of just besides athletes that can use the help too. Maybe this becomes somewhat a model. So how do you mentioned the athletes transition study, people find on they can search the web that way. Anything else you'd like to share about you and how people can find you from a sports psychology standpoint, or what we could do to help you out? This is your commercial now.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm located in Maryland. So I don't necessarily expect, if you have any questions about this, I'm happy to answer them. I'm the investigator who gets contacted through the website. So if you reach out to us through the website, athletetransitionstudy.com, I'll end up getting that email.
Okay.
If you are in this space with transitioning and retired athletes, I would ask you to please reach out to me and have a conversation, because the main way that we're finding participants is through direct communication with individuals who are willing to share with their network and ask them to take the study and let them know how important it is. Individual cases are really important. When you have someone like Michael Phelps sharing how hard the transition experience was, that absolutely is something that we listen to. But it can also be sort of cast aside as an exception to the rule. That was Michael's experience.
Right.
A study like the one we're conducting is necessary in order to back up those individual experiences as being more than just isolated cases. So I would implore anyone who played collegiate sport or its equivalent, if you're not in the typical collegiate pathway, go onto the website and take the survey. That is the single greatest thing you can do. It'll take you 25 minutes to contribute back to the future of athletes. And if you know people through your prior teams, people who you've run across, join us on social media, send them the link via email. Just help us to be able to build our sample pool. Because like I said, without those, we're all volunteers. None of us are getting paid for this.
Right.
Without people like you taking it, our efforts really are not going to amount to the impact that is really necessary and that we hope to make.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, I'm sure there's millions of former athletes that fit in this bill. So hopefully we can start getting so many help that we can give you. We certainly will. So it was great talking. I really appreciate all the time. Anybody, you can find us out on alumnidirect.com. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those things. But we really want to help impact and make a difference and continue to have shows like this that can help athletes and beyond. So thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.